What's up guys, Nikhil Uppal the Glue Guy here, back with another video for Triple G. So, many people say that the iPhone is better than any Android phone, but why? Let me explain. Let's start with a brief history of both operating systems. Android was started by Andy Rubin in 2003. It actually started for digital camera software, but it did not find a big enough market for that, so they decided to make an operating system instead. Google then bought Android for about $50 million and hired Mr. Rubin to work for them in 2005. The project started off very hot, but then became very underrated. Many people did not know the impact Android would have in the future. Then, in 2007, the first iPhone came out. The first iPhone was a big hit, mostly because it was running a very advanced polished software. But where had this software actually come from? Well, Apple had already made a quite impressive computer software for the Mac. So instead of making a new phone software, Apple decided to optimize Mac OS X for the iPhone. This was a very smart idea. Android, on the other hand, was based on nothing. It started from scratch. The only thing that Android had going for it at the time was it was open source. This meant that any hardware company could use its software freely and modify it for their liking. This was problematic when it came to branding, as I'll talk about later. 2007 was a great year for the iPhone, as the iPhone did pretty well. Google saw this as they were making some prototypes on their phone. They soon realized that they could not do it alone, so they created the Open Handset Alliance. The Open Handset Alliance consisted of 84 major tech companies. It was a way for Google to let selective companies work together to make Android's platform work as seamlessly as Apple's. Samsung, Qualcomm, LG, Motorola, Sony, and even some phone carriers such as T-Mobile joined this alliance. Apple, on the other hand, did not join this alliance as they were just doing well themselves. Their software was very simple to use and they controlled everything. People just loved their experience. Android at the time did not look like competition. But in 2008, 1 year after the iPhone was created, Android released their first flagship under HTC and T-Mobile. It was called the HTC Dream. It was slow, but Google apps such as Gmail and endless customization made the phone stand out. As I said before, it was slow, and the iPhone was much better optimized at the time. But why was the iPhone better optimized? That's the real question. Well, Apple controls the software and hardware of the devices. Android is usually in the hands of multiple companies. Let me explain. Let's say you have the Samsung J1, which is a fairly old, cheap phone. Samsung would make the hardware such as the camera, display, and processor, but they will not make their own software. Samsung would rely on Google's Android. So Google will give Android to Samsung, and then Samsung will optimize the phone to their best ability. However, that's not all. They also added a lot of unnecessary app, software, and other undesirable stuff to the OS that they thought would complete the package. A phone's carriers such as AT&T also had the ability to add their custom apps as well. One thing to keep in mind is, for Samsung to make the phone cheap, they put some really old, cheap processor in the phone, and Android had trouble running on a very slow processor. Especially when a company such as Samsung added so much extra to the OS. So of course, the phone was very slow. This resulted in some brand damage, and this brand damage continued. Samsung and LG were sincerely the biggest culprits. They manufactured countless number of phones, and each one was quite cheap. So people were excited to buy them because they did not have to pay iPhone price for smartphones. Now for a more tech-savvy user, this was alright, as they could still customize it and get rid of most of the useless stuff with a few simple tricks. However, most of the market for these budget phones were not very tech-savvy, so they hated the bloatware and decided to move to the iPhone and give their children the Android. I was one of the children given a cheap Android, or a cheap few Androids, but it was a little bit more tech-savvy than others, so I dealt with the bloatware on these phones. Many of my friends have also gotten old Android phones, but they gave up and decided that the iPhone was better just because their parents were using it with no complaints. Many companies such as HTC, Samsung, LG, and Motorola have really toned down the bloatware and only put actual helpful stuff in the phones that stock Android does not provide yet. But the average consumer would never turn back because they've had a negative connotation from their last encounter with the phone. Honestly, the iPhone is not better, but they've branded themselves better. Apple ads talk to the people like they're human with gigabytes of RAM never mentioned anywhere. People also, for some reason, perceive people with an iPhone to be in a higher social class. The iPhone is more expensive, but higher-end Android phones such as the Samsung Note 5 or the LG V10 are as expensive as iPhone, if not more expensive. So this perception is incorrect. Android ads, on the other hand, are not very easy to comprehend, and people do not perceive an Android user to be more superior to an iPhone user. All in all, it really depends on you and your values. If you like the way Apple has branded themselves, then buy an iPhone, no questions asked. But if you really value choice, then any Android would work for you. That's it, guys, and why the average consumer would say that the iPhone is better than any Android. I hope you enjoyed. Comment down below, what phone do you have and why? Have a good one.